Greetings, dear viewers. My name is Murad Tahmazov, Deputy Director at the Crescent Research Center, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation, which touches on one of the most pressing and complex topics in the Middle Eastern politics, post-conflict construction, and the future of governance in Syria. Today, I have the honor of speaking with Dr. David Mednicoff, an esteemed scholar whose work bridges law, politics, and development in the Middle East. Dr. Mednicoff is chair of department and of public policy and director of Middle Eastern studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. It's great to have you, and thank you for accepting our invitation, Mr. Mednicoff.
My pleasure. Good morning.
If you're ready, we can start with the first question. Let me begin with the first question, which concerns the fundamental pillar of any stable state, the rule of law. In the context of post-conflict Syria and the newly forming government, how might the idea of rule of law take shape? Do you foresee it being more instrumentalized by political elites, or could it become a genuine foundation for legal reform?
Yeah, so thanks very much for having me. I've always been very interested in Azerbaijan, although I've never had the opportunity to visit. Your question actually embeds a key point here, which is when a society is forming a government, something like the rule of law isn't necessarily present. We need political order first before one can talk about something like the rule of law. In my work, I see the rule of law as something that animates most political systems. There's a tendency for some Western scholars to have a strong set of institutional expectations about what the rule of law requires for us to even speak of the concept. But in my work across the Middle East and North Africa, I argue rather that political systems that are reasonably well established have both formal and informal rules that people understand and that keep some kind of stability in a system. And that can also mean that in some cases certainly that rulers feel subordinate to the law. But the main point is that where we have rule of law in most countries, there's a sense that most people expect rules to work in certain ways and political order to work in certain ways. In Syria, things are being constructed. So, this is a very delicate moment where, we don't really have full political order to speak of. And so, what I would hope is that if political order can be increasingly established, with that will come a more greater sense that expectations and rules are forming and are in place. And, that's a very big task because the challenge of building political order in a society that it experienced 14 years of civil war and massive displacement and the complete destruction of political institutions is extraordinary. So in some senses, as much as I believe the rule of law can be found almost anywhere in a post-conflict society as it has experienced as much disruption as Syria's, I think what we really need to be watching for is the gradual institutionalization of political order to begin with. And I think, we're all hopeful this week in seeing that the Gulf states have managed to get Syria's debts to the World Bank forgiven and managed to get the United States to begin working with the political system. I think what we really are looking for right now is economic progress, and that's, I think, if people in this very diverse system can move from the first stage of relief that the Assad government is gone to the new stage of believing the new government actually can put things together and begin to address the economic problems, then we can start hoping for political order. And then, in turn, yes, I think that what we've seen from the political system right now is that they want to work with diverse groups. They want to learn lessons both from the war and from the 2011 uprisings in the region and the sort of challenges that we saw with the governments not being able to stabilize those uprisings.
Thank you for the detailed answer. And you mentioned political institutions. I would like to ask a question about that specific topic. As Syria begins to rebuild its political institutions, what kind of constitutional framework do you think would be most viable or realistic for such a deeply divided society? Good models from Morocco or Tunisia offer any relevant lessons or perhaps warnings. Like as you know, Morocco is an absolute monarchy, but Tunisia is how to say, hybrid regime, but like a democracy, a functioning democracy. So which path is more realistic in your opinion?
And again, I think you're asking this is an excellent question, and it's actually not too early to be talking about this question, and I'm sure that the Syrian government is thinking about it as well. So I think the main thing that we should hope for and outsiders should encourage is simply that there is a constitution and a constitutional process that's very inclusive. I think that it is extremely important for outside experts to be cautious about dictating exactly what type of institutional arrangements or constitutional model in detail would apply for any given society. I mean, what matters, and I think we have learned this from the Tunisian case, is that we have a constitutional process that is absolutely internal. That is to say, it's not people like me, coming from the outside and writing it, even as well-meaning as we might be. And secondly, it's very inclusive. What Tunisia did very well, and this was not the case in another Arab situation, Egypt. What Tunisia did well was to really focus on a process that brought mostly internal actors to the table as advisors and drafters, and brought a wide range of actors, and in particular managed to bridge this gulf between people who are really looking for the constitution to have a very strong influence of a particular vision of Islam on lawmaking, and people who were eager to keep religion more out of politics. I mean, what Tunisia did is bring those people together and craft a document that could give some credence to Islam as a very important pillar of legislative and other inspiration, without posing a kind of vision of Sharia or specific model of Islam as a strongly dictating force in the document. And that's in contrast to what the elected government of Egypt did when they drafted a constitution kind of behind closed doors in a very short time frame. So what Tunisia did well was to have a fairly long drafting process, a very internal, indigenous, if you like, process, and one that was very inclusive. Morocco is also not a terrible model in that it explicitly, within the context of a system that was the same, it was not a new political system, of course, within the context of a system that remained in power after 2011, managed to do more around minority rights, which I think you want to talk about as well. And it was sort of explicit in recognizing certainly a major minority, the indigenous peoples of Morocco, the pre-Islamic Arab population, and in so doing, also managed to bring a greater sense of inclusion. So I think what really matters in these documents may not be the specific institutional arrangements, but the sense that this is really a document that people can stand behind and buy into. And the last thing I want to say about this is that people do care about constitutions. I mean, this is again where the rule of law is something that matters in many, many different societies. I mean, it often surprises analysts from democracies that constitutions in societies that are not democratic seem to matter. The debates about them really matter. Now, of course, Syria may well aspire to be an open political system and democracy, but even like in Morocco, where it's clearly not a full democracy, people felt very staked in that constitutional process. And what it goes to show is that there is a sense that the rule of law really matters. The safeguards that a constitution provides, even in a system that doesn't have a level of civil and political rights of a full democracy, are significant. And so this will be a really important drafting process for Syria. And the best hope is to really make it deliberative, quite consultative from a lot of different groups, particularly in the context of Syria's multiple groups, and as inclusive in terms of broad leaders as it possibly can be. And all of this is very hard. It didn't succeed. A constitution like this did not succeed in keeping Tunisia democratic, but it certainly helped Tunisia manage for the years before its president pushed it in a more authoritarian direction.
Yeah, you rightly mentioned that we will talk about the minority rights, and I think it's the time. Minority rights are, of course, of a particularly urgent concern in post-conflict settings in Syria. In your view, how might a future Syrian government address minority rights in a meaningful way? What role could transitional justice mechanisms play in protecting these communities and fostering long-term coexistence between those communities? And would you say the recent massacres against the Alawite minority are anomalies, or rather early signs of a deeper, more violent trend?
This really is that terrible and challenging problem for Syria. I mean, a country where so many people have known war, mistrust, even before the civil war, and separation by religious and other ethnic grouping. It's very hard to build intergroup trust. I mean, this is really, really hard. One of the reasons that Tunisia did as well as it did was that it's a fairly monolithic society. There aren't a lot of diverse religious groups. It's a major challenge for Syria, and of course, we don't even know if Syria will be able to hold together as a unified state. And of course, it's still already the new government is not in control of the entire region that had been the Syrian state. So all of these are gigantic problems, and I don't want to minimize them. And there's no there's no simple way to a magic wand that can get rid of more than a decade and, in some cases decades of complete mistrust. And, what we don't want to see in Syria is the level of institutionalized division that, for example, Lebanon has experienced or Iraq seems to be experiencing now. So it's very, very challenging. I am happy to see that transitional justice initiatives have been announced in Syria. I think that that's very important. I think that we know that the way for groups that have a long pattern of mistrust to work together is to put them in contact with one another, but this is something that takes a lot of time. Trust building can take decades or even centuries. And so, what has to happen is for the new government, as it's been trying to do, to reach out to as many groups as it can, to refrain from making statements and taking political decisions that would seem to institutionalize a particular vision of, Sunni Islamic political orthodoxy, but that really show that this government is driven by the desire to really bring Syrians together. So I think, obviously, because the Alawites have been tied with the previous political system, it's particularly important both that people who are very complicit in the Assad regime be brought to justice in a fair and meaningful way, and that Alawites more generally can feel protected. I know that Druze are obviously another minority that's very fearful of the new government and that immediately to be brought into play. But none of this is easy, and this is all very slow. And I think that what really is critical, despite the fact that I'm no economist, is for enough economic hope to take shape so that people have some reason to kind of hold on, and those folks who want to work with the government can have more sway than those people who are quick to mistrust and are quick to come to judgments that the new government is not interested in ruling for most Syrians. Again, as from a distance, it looks as if the new government really is committed to trying to do reconstruction for the entire country and not just for a small group of Sunnis who have a particular religious political vision. So, this is hard. If there were a simple answer, it would work in a lot of other societies. Libya is another place that obviously we're seeing grave difficulties about any type of political unification. But I think that the economic news for last week and the willingness of the Gulf countries to really take a big role in helping with finance and reconstruction, that's where the hope lies.
Lastly, I would like to talk about the international dimension. So far, we have dealt with the divisions in Syrian society, and we know that if there's a serious level of division in a country, then international players will try to utilize these divisions in order to maximize their own interests, and that's what's happening in Syria and what's been happening since the civil war started. For example, Iran is not happy with Assad regime's fall, and Israel is not happy of an establishment of a probably Sunni Islamic driven government that might be close ally of Turkey, which doesn't have the best relations with Israel. And USA tries to protect a Kurdish presence in Syria as a quasi state, let's say. So, how do you evaluate the international players, be it foreign governments or even international organizations or even NGOs? What role can they play in Syria's legal or political reconstruction?
Yeah, I think that 2 weeks ago I would have been more cynical and slightly less hopeful than I am today, and I think that that's because we're in a very strange international moment in the Middle East and in Syria particularly. It's a moment in which Iran's external politics, political projection has been really crippled, and Iran has more limited capacity to be involved in a very strong way in Arab politics than it had been able to for the last 20, 30 years, and that the strange thing about the Trump administration, and this is something that President Trump actually likes to play up, is that it's unpredictable. Typically U.S. foreign policy has fallen within a variety of somewhat clear patterns, and often there's kind of there are internal contradictions between the values that American foreign policy does espouse in the world often, and some of the particular strategic priorities. But the Trump administration you never really know what's going to happen, and that's something of a function of the fact that as much as for folks like us who understand international relations in detail, would find not looking at foreign relations in terms of patterns to be strange. That's the way Trump operates. I mean, it doesn't matter that there have been 40, 50 years of U.S. political priorities. What matters is that he connects with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. He sees kind of a friend, and he listens to that leader's priorities. Well, it happens that Gulf countries are pretty unified right at this moment around wanting to see stable Syrian reconstruction. And sure, these countries are happy that a Sunni leadership is in power, but I believe that Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates have learned from previous efforts at involving themselves in a very sectarian way and funding military intervention in both Syria and in the Saudis' case in Yemen. I think that they've learned that that's not, pardon the metaphor, the best bang for the buck, but actually working together around reconstruction and stabilization, is both a way of kind of making up for mistakes I think that the leaders felt their predecessors made in Syrian policy, and a way of actually establishing something stable. So, and Turkey is, to some extent, it has its own interests, but is working in that way too. And so what we've seen is that Trump has kind of pushed aside to some extent Netanyahu's concerns. I mean, we hear some pressure around Syria's leadership talking about normalizing with Israel. I mean, I have argued myself, as have some of my friends, for a long time, that this is actually a moment where we could see some kind of a big picture solution to a lot of the problems of the region. It's very unlikely, but it's more plausible than it has been for a long time because, again, Trump could say, what I want is to win a Nobel Peace Prize. And, I can do that if I get all these countries to work together. And so, I think we're in this bizarre geopolitical moment where there is some hope. It's not a lot of hope, but there is some hope that there's enough actors that want the same thing, which is a stable region that, Syrian reconstruction is a distinct possibility. I think that we're not talking about Gaza. That's a whole other major challenge that I think is I'm very skeptical about because of the Trump administration's past lack of concern for Palestinians. But I do think that this is an interesting moment where there's the states in the region and outside have some capacity to push for reconstruction. There's a lot of guilt around what happened with Syria. And that's where, also international organizations and donors really matter, because the other thing that happened was the Syrian refugee crisis went on for so long that partnerships between NGOs and wealthy donors took place and actually helped Syrians in Jordan and Lebanon and elsewhere. And I think that those partnerships could well revitalize with the idea that we are in a somewhat more hopeful landscape than, we've been for 15 years in this conflict.
Dr. Mednicoff, thank you for your time and for sharing your expertise with us. Your insights today have really helped us better understand the complex situation in post-civil war Syria. And to our viewers and listeners, thank you for joining us today. We hope the discussion has given you a deeper understanding into the path ahead for Syria and the broader implications for transitional justice. Until next time, stay well and stay informed.
Thank you very much.